Hey there. You ever read any of Carl Jung's work? This is one of the really precious volumes in his collected works, volume 10. It's a lot of really important, famous essays. One of the most famous of which, and probably the reason most people buy this book in the collected works, is Jung has a very influential essay on flying saucers. The title of which is Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. This was published in Switzerland in 1958, I believe, at least the English translation. And it was in response to an enormous flurry of, at the time, so-called UFO activity in America and elsewhere. And Jung wrote a very strange, long, most of Jung's writings are like academic articles or lecture lengths, 30 to 40 to 50 pages. And he has over 20 volumes of that kind of writing. But he wrote an essay that's almost 150 pages on the topic of flying saucers. And Jung was, at the time that he wrote this, one of certainly, if not the most eminent psychologist in the world. He had had a long association with the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, and had been a very close colleague of Freud and co-worker in the foundation of the psychoanalytic movement. And then there was a kind of break from Freud, which Freudians and Jungians and others, of course, tell their own versions of. But Jung is one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, without question. And his work on UFOs is regularly cited by the academic experts on this topic, sometimes called UAPs today. For example, Diana Walsh-Pasulka, in her superb and groundbreaking book, American Cosmic, UFOs, Technology and Religion, published by Oxford University Press, and which I reviewed at the Los Angeles Review of Books when it came out, she references this essay on flying saucers by the psychologist Carl Jung a number of times in her book. And if you haven't read anything about this subject, then, I just want you to know you're not going to understand a lot of what I'm going to talk about in today's talk, but that's completely fine. I just want you to be aware of that. It doesn't mean I hope it wouldn't be interesting to you. But this is the third episode in a series I've been doing on the philosophy of angels, which I've argued and shown are messengers that unite all of our different spiritual and religious cultural traditions throughout time and space. And the second most recent episode was a very important one on Hanukkah and Christmas and the idea of messengers of light and why we have these holidays of light. And if you haven't seen that, I would encourage you to check it out and check out the first episode in this series. They're linked below. Because in this episode, I'm going to build on those prior two episodes. And everyone who has some familiarity with this field or my work will have different responses to what I'm about to say. And I don't normally address this publicly because there's so much lack of clarity around what the scientific standards of treating this subject are. But I think that's become an excuse. We have had a lot of academic growth in this field. And so the question I want to address today is there a special contribution that philosophy can make, specifically my philosophy, my understanding of philosophy as a way of life that is meta-scientific, that is based on engaging all of the existing scientific scholarly expertise and consciously acknowledging they need to be integrated into a higher level domain, which is the domain of expert synthesis. And those of you who know my work know that's kind of my specialized work, as I'm a specialist in integration. I have an academic specialty in the philosophy of religion and its relationship to science and history. So I have expertise in historiography, the philosophy of science, particularly the philosophy of religion, with an extensive knowledge of the history of Christianity and a good knowledge of the history of Judaism and a number of other religious spiritual traditions. And the unifying theme in all of my work is my expertise on philosophy as a way of life, both as a historian of philosophy and science and religion, and as a practitioner who has been building an institution for 7 years, the Marginalia Review of Books, that publishes the world's best scientists and scholars and consciously integrates their research to bring it to the public for free so that they have excellent access to high quality rigorous scholarly scientific thinking, and also so that the public has access to the synthetic work by the leading, you could say, meta scientists or people who are doing expert synthesis. And I work with those people, and I am a research director and the founder of the Institute for the Meanings of Science at the Marginalia Review of Books. And so my concern about this topic is professional. As a scholar of the philosophy of religion and science, I'm interested in, can we as philosophers of religion, at least as I understand this idea, contribute to this topic? And this topic has become very relevant again in the news because there's been a number of these drones that have been sighted in New Jersey and other states. I can personally attest that I've seen them a number of times in my own backyard. I live the eastern part of the United States. And I've recorded at least twice some of these on my phone. I don't claim to know what these things are, but I have seen them with my own eyes in the past 2 months, and I've seen them regularly. So I want to talk about how my philosophical approach might help people think about this topic, particularly if you don't have any interest in the topic or you think it's weird or unscientific. I want to explain 3 things in today's presentation. And the first is why this topic is extremely important scientifically and even more philosophically. So why the topic is important scientifically and philosophically. And the second question I want to address is why the topic is so difficult to address coherently. So the difficulty of the topic. So first, the importance of the topic, and particularly in philosophy and science. Secondly, the difficulty of the topic. Why is it difficult to address? And third, the opportunity of the topic to give us a new insight into where we are as human beings in history and what the future of philosophy and spirituality and science might be based on considering this phenomenon. Now, this is a very introductory talk. I normally only do talks like this as a paid speaker and consultant because my intellectual property is valuable, of course, but I love sharing what I can with the public. And so I want to give all of you in the public a basic overview to my way of thinking about this to introduce you to what I hope could also offer some practical clarity in a confusing time. So I want to start with why the topic is so important. And the first answer to the question is that if you have objects that experts in the aeronautics, aviation, and military sectors of your society perceive on their equipment, then those are obviously dangerous to all aircraft and to everyone beneath these objects. Insofar as you have a flying object that you don't know what it is and can't account for it, and you have a legal responsibility of care for airspace, the same way an owner of land has a legal responsibility to care in a proper way for their land so that it doesn't damage someone else. Like if you have a sinkhole in your land and it's going to go into your neighbor's yard, you need to address that. So if you're the, FAA or any, other government's equivalent, you want to understand what's in your airspace. And if you're the military, you want to understand what's in your airspace. And, if you're a scientist who works at NASA or another place, who works in the aerospace industry, you obviously want to understand what is flying in the sky, especially if we don't know what it is from our own governments or our own programs. So that level of importance is quite obvious, but it's been ignored. And the role of professional pilots like Ryan Graves and others has been very important. He has a nonprofit devoted to this topic and safety on this topic. And that's been a big development in this issue. And now a second reason that the issue is very important is scientifically, you can't claim to be interested in science if you ignore this topic. And what I mean by that is not that you can't be a scientist who's doing good scientist, but you can't obviously say, I care about science as a way of life, and science involves looking at phenomena we don't understand and accepting that we're completely ignorant about them and using all the tools we have in science to address this. Avi Loeb, for example, is trying to do that. He's an astronomer at Harvard. I've interviewed him. You can watch that interview on my channel, on Marginally Review of Books channel. And you can listen to it on my podcast, the audio version. And so there are some scientists who've done this, but basically the topic has been made completely untouchable in terms of a stigma. And I felt that myself. I was one of the people who thought it was a ridiculous, or not ridiculous, I just didn't think there was anything to it seriously until I read Diana Pasulka's book by Oxford, American Cosmic. And then I was like, wow, I was really quite wrong about this. And I need to think about this because as a philosopher of religion, this is frankly right up my alley. So you can see how I responded to that in my review of of Dr. Pasulka's book. And this issue unites all of us who are interested in it, even if we don't know each other yet, and we only have very kind of professional or strange contact meeting around or through this issue. It's a strange fact that since 2017, there's been an enormous explosion of material on this issue. And so if you haven't been exposed to that, you need to understand the third reason that this issue is important is first, because we need to know it's in the air from a scientific, military, and aeronautic standpoint. Secondly, because scientifically it's irresponsible to ignore ignorance about such a decisively important phenomena that is plenty of people having very documented encounters with apparently physical objects that are material and could have material consequences if they crashed or hurt people that are flying in the sky that we don't have any understanding of. So scientifically, obviously, it's important. And philosophically, therefore, philosophers should care about it. And thirdly, it's incredibly important at an existential level because unknown power constitutes the promise of unknown significance. Unknown power constitutes the promise of unknown significance. Now, this brings us to the second part of the lecture, which is addressing the question, why is this topic so difficult to address coherently? And that is connected to this third point, which I would say is the distinctively philosophical point, which is this topic itself embodies what I call an existential epistemic crisis. So an existential crisis could be, for example, a tragic separation or passing away in your life that leads you completely forlorn emotionally, like the passing of a parent or someone you love, God forbid, or something like this. That's an existential crisis. And you can have an existential crisis for lots of reasons, none of which are strange epistemologically, meaning it's not like there's some problem about knowledge and you're not understanding. It's like you understand what happened and it really confuses you or hurts you. So it might cause a sort of loss of certainty, but what causes that loss of certainty, what causes the existential crisis, right, isn't itself epistemic or to do with knowledge. Epistemology is the logos, or the true understanding of, the true way of explaining and accounting for and giving a true account of episteme, scientific knowledge, or what approximates to it in our endeavors as scientists and scholars and philosophers. So an existential crisis does not have to be an epistemic crisis. Likewise, an epistemic crisis does not have to be an existential crisis. So, for example, the famous conflict, as it were, in physics between the implications of Einstein's theory of gravity in general relativity, which were derived logically from the implications of Einstein's theory of light in his theory of special relativity. Those implications of the ideas of gravity that we accept from Einstein that have been very well established, they don't easily synthesize in any obvious way with the physics revolution known as quantum mechanics. And Einstein himself played a role in that, and Einstein himself throughout his life basically refused to accept the way the field of quantum mechanics was framed. He thought it somehow was obviously getting us to something, but it couldn't itself be physically accurate. And Einstein's position has been widely rejected by the scientific community, but they take it seriously, of course, as physics. But Einstein's late work is often sort of seen to be ignoring the development of what was known in science. So that's a very serious, you could say, epistemic crisis in physics, which there's been more and more work on, and many figures in the kind of very intellectually rigorous commentariat, if you might call it that. Sabine Hassenfelder, a very popular YouTube channel. She's I believe, a theoretical physicist. Eric Weinstein is a I believe, a mathematician from Harvard, a theoretical physicist and kind of economist in terms of, I think, a lot of his applied interests. He has a podcast or had a podcast, and he's a commentator who's talked a great deal about this. The Perimeter Institute is an entire institute whose foundation in Canada is a very important scientific institute, and it's designed kind of around addressing this issue. And so there's many books about this, and it's a serious issue for science. So it's an exciting thing to think about and talk about, but it's not per se an existential crisis. It certainly shows us something is really exciting to be discovered in physics, and we don't understand as much as we might hope we do or think we do. But that scientific crisis to me is a really good example of clearly an epistemic crisis, a crisis about what knowledge is, a crisis that involves disputes about claims to knowledge. And that is a very sophisticated issue. And if you want to learn about that, you need to learn some of the philosophy and history of science. And I would recommend, I have a free introduction to Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I'm going to finish that series in the new year, but I would watch the first 7 or 8 lectures if you're interested in that. So I can't give you 8 hours of material on this or introduce you to the philosophy of science, but I'm going to assume a lot of that. And so if something doesn't come across quite clearly, I hope you'll just understand that some of this assumes some background. So just to be clear then where we're at, we went from the fact that an unknown power represents sort of unknown epistemic potential and opportunity and challenges. And we said this is connected to why this topic is so difficult to address coherently. And so we've seen the topic's very important. So why is it then such a strange topic, meaning some people still attach a stigma to it? And I'm not going to address the fact of the government's role in the past, potentially aspects creating that stigma. That seems clearly to have been ended. And the government has self-consciously for the past 7 years seemed to be seeking to understand this issue itself and bring the information to the general public. So the issue of the stigma is I'm addressing is scientific or philosophical itself. Most philosophers don't write about this. And most philosophers who do write about it from the standpoint of conventional academic philosophy. And so the difficulty is, first of all, that we don't know how to talk about any of the aspects of this subject in a way that another member of the broader philosophical or scientific or scholarly community won't immediately contest. So that's a very difficult position to be in. And that definitely indicates that there's a epistemic crisis, that this issue of UFOs or UAPs or angels in the sky. I mean, the angels in the sky have been something people have always thought they've seen. And we're going to see that this phenomenon is connected to astronomy. And it baffles me, to be honest, why it is not more connected to astronomy and astrology. And I think that's frankly because there's some just level of ignorance around the importance of the history of astrology and astronomy for the understanding of philosophical, religious, and scientific ideas, like I brought out in the last episode on this series on Hanukkah and Christmas and the superhuman. And if you have to understand this material about the two-tiered cosmology and the microcosm, macrocosm to understand, I think, why the stars and planets have been neglected in this. And so there's definitely an epistemic crisis, and that is to do with that at the root level, there's no agreement upon what concepts, tools, or methods we should use to engage or describe this subject matter. Okay, so that's the epistemic crisis. But we've seen an epistemic crisis is not the same as an existential crisis. An existential crisis is not the same as an epistemic crisis. Now, this may be tedious to some of you, but it's very important, you could say logically, to understand, even if this issue is an existential epistemic crisis, and I've claimed it is, then that's the root of the difficulty of addressing it coherently. That doesn't mean that it's an existential crisis because it's epistemic, or that it's an epistemic crisis because it's existential. We don't know how those things relate, and I'm going to explore that. But I am going to argue at the end of this section that it is indeed a crisis such that the distinction between the epistemic dimension, what we know and how we know it, and the existential dimension, how dramatically it threatens to affect our lives or undermine our sense of some important aspect of reality or existence, that these are actually in this topic inseparable. And so this is a kind of even deeper reason that it's very difficult to address coherently. So what then should we do in such a situation? Well, see if we can further specify the nature of this existential epistemic crisis. And the easiest way to do that is to consider this Jung essay from so many years ago, 1958. And I'm just going to do that for a couple minutes, and I'm just going to address the very beginning of the essay. Jung makes a claim, which sounds strange if you don't know a lot about the history of religion or psychology, or if you haven't read a lot of Jung's work and realize how erudite he was. He integrated just an incredible knowledge into his psychotherapeutic practice. He says, "It is not presumption that drives me, but my conscience as a psychiatrist," Jung had an MD, "that bids me fulfill my duty and prepare those few who will hear me for coming events which are in accord with the end of an era. As we know from ancient Egyptian history, there are manifestations of psychic changes which always appear at the end of one Platonic month and at the beginning of another." So he says, as we know from Egyptian history, this is a kind of, I don't know, you could say annoyingly like knowing sort of thing scholars like Jung sometimes do. It's like, we don't know this, certainly not anymore. So fortunately, there's an enormous scientific literature on this now on great YouTube videos. So let me just give you a very brief explanation of what he's saying here, because he's obviously just suggesting there's something apocalyptic in his view as a psychiatrist about this issue from a psychiatric phenomenon, that it marks somehow the end of an objective era of space-time. And if you think astrology has nothing to do with science, I'm not an astrologer, nor do I have any philosophical commitments to astrology, but astrology and astronomy were not historically distinguished very clearly at all until really the early modern world. And astrology remains very influential and surprisingly, elite circles among some heads of state. And so if you don't know that, it's just important as a historian, as a philosopher, as a citizen of existence, to have an understanding of the fact that the stars have always been seen as very powerful. And that's quite obviously true, that the stars are powerful, even if they're nothing like what astrology says, for example. And so when Jung is making this claim about the end of an era, he's referring to something objective, which is the concept of the Platonic year. And if you've seen my Substack, I've been writing a series on the Platonic year, so you can look at the first two posts if you would like. But the Platonic year is the concept of the totality of 12 Platonic months. What are the 12 Platonic months? Well, there's two answers. The historical answer comes from what today is called astrology, which is a Platonic year is the complete sequence or passage through the 12 Platonic months, and a Platonic month is the time of transit through one of the 12 zodiacs, which are basically the very large-scale visible constellations that we see in different hemispheres at different times, correlating with a pattern of movement that can be very accurately predicted and tracked with the tools of the naked eye. And this was therefore the basis of people looking up into the skies and not just seeing the sun and the moon, but trying to observe other patterns. So it's the foundational basis empirically of astronomy as a science, is the observation of the visible sky and the visible constellations and the tracking of their movement. Now, the constellations in the concept of a Platonic month have to do with the idea of an age or an era. And the idea is that one Platonic age or era is, say, the era of Pisces is the era in which roughly 2,000 years to 2,000, maybe 300-400 years, you get the dominant influence from the astrological perspective because of its position, literally its actual astronomical position of the particular ruling zodiac for that age. So the age of Pisces, for example, is roughly the last 2,000 years. And therefore, the age that follows Pisces is a transit into a 2,000 plus year age of Aquarius. So if you've ever heard that phrase, age of Aquarius, or the old song, Age of Aquarius, I can't remember the band who sings that song, but I think from the 60s or 50s or 70s, the concept is referring to this idea of this roughly 2,000 year cycle through the influence that it has over the Earth from an astrological standpoint. Now, 12 of these together, therefore, make up roughly somewhere between 24,000 to 26,000 years, depending on how you calculate this. So that's the historical idea of what Jung is talking about. Now, you could say, well, I don't care about that historical idea. I only care about science. Well, that idea is scientific in the sense that literally that is what the stars are doing. And the remarkable scientific way to explain this is a correlation, which is that the precessional cycle of the Earth. If you don't know what the precessional cycle of the Earth is, please look it up and see a picture. It's very simple, but it's the fact that as the Earth is spinning, it tilts on its axis, I think up to about 11.5%, if I remember right. And because the Earth is not just rotating perfectly, the rotatory motion tilts. That rotatory motion creates a pattern relative to the astrological months, which basically correlates more or less exactly with the idea of the Platonic year, also called the Great Year, which is to say about 26,000 or 25,000 or 24,000 years for a complete precessional cycle of the Earth. So from a modern scientific standpoint, the idea of the Platonic month or the Platonic year has to do with the Platonic month as a roughly 1/12th division of the Earth's roughly 24,000, 26,000 year precessional cycle. So this precessional cycle's correlation with the astrological houses of the major 12 visible constellations of the zodiac, which are found in all the major civilizational traditions in China, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and on. We get them largely from Babylonian, and you could argue like Jung is saying Egyptian study of the stars. This correlation is quite interesting. So I propose always in these contexts what I call a spiritual materialism, which is a materialism that says everything that seems significant, including spiritual things, should be thought of as only material, as a kind of first hypothesis. And I don't think most materialists are at all good materialists because they appeal to non-material things all the time, like ideas, things they give no material explanation of. So the idea that like the stars influence us is obviously true. If the sun didn't exist, the Earth would go out of existence. So the sun is the nearest star, and without it, world life as we know it wouldn't exist. So obviously astral influences are existentially essential and crucial. Now, I'm not getting into astrology, and particularly what's called juridical astrology. If you know anything about this, that is the claims to make judgments or understand the meaning of the stars. I'm not at all commenting on that. Although, again, that's very important to understand if you at all want to know history and the history of science and politics and magic and religion, for example. But I'm not talking about that. You don't need to believe in that. I'm not talking about whether I believe in that. I don't know enough about it. I'm interested in it as a historian and philosopher. And I think that's the first step anyway. How could you rationally even ask whether something should be personally believed in when you don't even have a good scholarly or scientific way of understanding what it is as a phenomenon in people's minds, right? So the role of the stars is scientifically, historically, spiritually, and existentially essential in the interpretation of human events as humans have understood them, because humans have seen the stars as having an enormous influence. And so from recognizing the obvious influence of the moon and the sun on us, our ancient ancestors, well up into the present, for people who believe in this, have thought, yeah, well, obviously then these very powerful stars that are close enough to be visible to us and to exist in patterns that we can predict of, so they're in some kind of relationship with the orbit of the Earth around the sun and the moon. These stars are stars that we are in some persistent patterned relationship with. And if you see a persistent pattern in nature, scientifically speaking, you desire to have a better understanding of that pattern. And so without believing in anything about astrology or juridical astrology, it is quite obviously scientifically important to simply ask the question, if the sun is so important to us and the moon is so important to us, and we know now scientifically planets like Jupiter protect us, they have these enormous capacities to influence us and redirect, asteroids or other bodies, and we don't have any even decent understanding of this. We've just sent a major mission to the Jupiter moons Europa, which is incredible. We did that on October 17th, I believe, this year, and it is going to reach Europa in 2030. So we're just beginning to learn about even the moons of Jupiter and other planets But what we know, the more we learn about the planets, is the more we know they have a decisive and important physical influence on the Earth. Okay. So that premise of astrology is obviously totally scientific. Like I said, it's a totally different, way more complicated question to say, okay, does that mean astrology has any validity? I don't know. Ask the astrologers who know all the science and want to defend their work. I'm not doing that. I'm talking to you as an academic and as a teacher and as a person who thinks we need to take these ideas seriously, regardless of whether we think that they're true or not in some deeper personal or cosmic sense. So the role of the stars is the first proof that the existential and scientific dimension of this topic are connected, and that's why the epistemic crisis in this case is probably not going to be separable from the existential crisis. And if we won't even acknowledge why our ancestors and people today have believed in the influence of the stars, and if we don't take that seriously, we're not going to be in a good position to interpret any new novel phenomena that we see in the heavens above us that have very unclear patterns, right? So in other words, if there's clear patterns in the stars and the planets, and we don't agree on how to interpret those patterns, or we've disagreed about whether those patterns existed and then conceded when we learned scientifically, okay, there are patterns. There's definitely a big influence of the moon on tides and other things. So presumably there's some kind of influence of Mars and of Venus and of Jupiter and of Saturn and of Mercury, and of Pluto and of Uranus and other things. Then, we don't know what the influence is, for example, of radiation and other light and things coming from other stars. We just don't know. We know there would likely be some influence based on everything we know scientifically. And scientifically, we couldn't comment on what that influence is at the level of astronomy as it currently exists. So that leaves us with a very interesting question, which is, okay, we know there's a scientific basis to this whole topic, which is the influence of visible celestial bodies, lights in the sky, visible lights in the sky having an influence on the Earth. Okay, so we know that there is a widespread understanding that the visible lights in the sky that we call the sun, the moon, and the stars, and the planets, that these have a significant influence on the ideas humans have of their life, and that many of the most important decisions and events in human history have been interpreted according to and influenced by the idea of these correlations or these influences of astral or celestial lights upon the Earth. We also know scientifically that light definitely affects material bodies. We know that you can harm and heal with different forms of radiation, which light is a form of radiation. And we don't know how that may or may not relate to, constellations or astrology, but we know that certainly the basic idea is that the celestial bodies in the sky above us directly affect our material existence as material bodies, that light is a material phenomenon that has a direct influence on other material phenomenon, and that therefore light from the stars, I see a star coming out right now outside my window, light from the stars would have an important influence that, we don't understand yet, but would be worth looking into, taking seriously. So far, we have asked the question, why is this important? The topic of lights in the skies that are called UFOs or UAPs. And we've seen that there's answers to do with military, society, or markets, of like finances, right? If you're flying planes, you have an aerospace company and you don't know what's in the sky, that could affect your life, your business. So there's very important reasons as well, scientifically, of course, to take these things seriously. So there's all kinds of reasons to know what's important. But then why is it so difficult to address coherently? And I said the basic answer to that is to do with the third issue of importance, which is we have an unknown power, which means there's unknown significance scientifically and philosophically. And a power with unknown significance is by definition a threat to the human sense of comfort. I'm not saying it's an actual threat at all. I'm saying that anything that we know is powerful and we know is unknown, the human mind perceives as a threat by evolutionary instinct. This is a scientific fact. So not always, our curiosity is related to this, but we have to make a decision about whether something is dangerous to us or not. And if we're wrong, of course, about it being dangerous, we get in trouble or maybe don't pass on our genetic material from a scientific evolutionary standpoint. And so we're quite cautious and risk averse in many cases. We're not always like this, but we see this animal instinct plays a role in psychology. And so I think, therefore, the tools we need to address this topic are the tools, first of all, of awareness of the scientific character of the phenomena as a topic, which is to say what's typical, what's atypical about it. Well, what's atypical about it is that it's obviously very important and yet obviously very difficult to deal with because no one agrees on the categories even to address it. So it's obviously scientifically important, but it's also obviously not obvious scientifically and from a broader sense of scholarly study as a philosopher of religion, like Diana Pasulka, who's also a scholar of religion. It's been realized recently, maybe we need to bring in these people with expertise like Dr. Pasulka has, and maybe also the philosophers like me could be useful. And we all obviously all know we need the physical sciences. So, and sociology and psychology, hence I brought in Jung. And I brought in Jung to show that the framework for interpreting this event from his standpoint was a 26,000-year scientific process called the precessional cycle, which correlates in astrological terms with the great or Platonic year of a session of 12 Platonic months of roughly 2,000 years. And the transition from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And if you look this up in astrology, no astrologers agree, as far as I can tell, on when we enter the age of Aquarius, but most agree that we did. And people have been talking about this as possibly having happened as early as the 19th century to as late as, not having quite happened yet. But the idea is that there is a correlation between the transition of Platonic months and world historical events. And as a matter of fact, this is true. Much of early Jewish literature surrounding the messianic figure of Yehoshua or Joshua or Jesus interprets the arrival of Jesus or Yehoshua roughly 2,000 years ago, maybe 2020, maybe more like 2,030 years ago. It interprets this in terms of this cosmology in which the stars are also understood in relationship to God's and angels' consciousness. And stars you could think of in some ways as almost like the visible body of a kind of much higher intelligence, the same way our physical bodies is the manifestation of our brain or some spiritual intelligence, whether that spiritual intelligence is physically just the brain and the body working as a whole, or there's some more subtle intelligence that's material in a way we don't understand yet. This is again on my hypothesis of spiritual materialism. Interpret all phenomena, even so-called spiritual phenomena, as a first hypothesis as being somehow purely material. Now, if we do that, then the only things that we can think about is the obvious background scientifically and philosophically to interpret unknown lights in the sky would be the stars and the planets. And I'll use sometimes the stars to mean the planets in the broad sense. The planets were called the wandering stars from the Greek word planeo, I wander, which is how the planets were named because they're stars that are not in the same fixed, reliable pattern of orbit as the stars, for example, in the 12 constellations. So that's this old sense in which star can include planet as the planets as the wandering stars. And the wandering stars or the planets are, of course, very important as the very bright visible stars like Venus coming out in the west every evening. And so these have played an enormous role in the prayers, piety, philosophy, sort of spirituality of human beings. And humans have seen these bodies' positions relative to other visible stars as connected to great world historical transformations. So I don't know how to address a person who doesn't think that matters because you can just say, well, it's a coincidence. And I would agree. However, 2,000 years ago, a new energy entered into the world that integrated its Jewish background in Galilee and created a global alteration of consciousness over the past 2,000 years. That's a historical fact. The same way it's a historical fact that Marxism entered the world about 180 years ago and it has created a global alteration of consciousness. And that global alteration of consciousness created by Marxism is directly connected to its reality as a form of the Jewish Christian apocalyptic messianic movement. And I discussed that at length in one of the episodes in my series Origins, which really lays out the scientific, historical, philosophical framework as a scholar. I think that we all need to understand where we're at today. And so you can see that linked below if you want to listen to it. And the first few episodes are free. You can listen to them on my podcast. And if you've liked this channel and you want to support it, I would say please do subscribe right now, like this channel, and buy Origins or buy one of my other courses. It helps keep this work going and shows that you appreciate the value of what I'm doing. So we know then that from a materialistic standpoint, we're going to have to take the stars as our best place to start with this phenomenon. And I would suggest to you that the reason it's so difficult to address this phenomenon coherently is that fact that I personally think of as quite obvious when you say it like that. That fact is not obvious in the broader UFO UAP discussion. And I find that very strange because my limited knowledge of this field, and including my own personal experience observing some of this phenomenon, is that often it appears to be stars or the planets like Venus that will have the effects of these phenomena. Like Venus seems sometimes to move or pulse in a way that seems extremely patterned and non-random. Or Venus will seem sometimes, or another planet. I mean, a person who knows where the planets are in the night sky would know, okay, that's that planet. But then it's like, it looks like the planet moves, or maybe the planet suddenly, zooms towards you. So if you look at the empirical literature connected to this phenomenon, the idea that something looks like a star and is moving is one of the most basic substrates scientifically of the phenomenon. Particularly because a star is a pinprick of dynamic, generally like somewhat visibly oscillatory light patterns in the night sky. And therefore, anything we can see in the night sky is going to be some kind of pattern of light, generally speaking, unless it's something so dark we see it as an outline against the illuminated night sky. But it's generally going to be an oscillation of light, and therefore it's going to strike us physiologically as the exact kind of context to seeing a star moving. So this first premise then immediately allows us to get much more historically grounded on this phenomenon. And my philosophy is, how do we respond to an existential epistemic crisis? And I would say one of the things I think is unique about my own work is I specialize in basically thinking about major epistemic crises. I've been working on this for over 20 years. I first read Thomas Kuhn in conjunction with reading Willard Van Orman Quine's fantastic work on this subject based on behavioral psychology, great analytic epistemologist. And I read that work when I was 18 years old. And I realized in conjunction with Clifford Geertz's anthropology, I was also reading his book, The Patterns of Culture, that these were really the most fundamental thing I needed to know to do any work as an academic. I need to know how to understand experts, how to assess experts, how to learn from people, how to know what was happening based on the dynamics of the communities who were representing knowledge. And so I've always been doing that, as well as other normal scholarly, specialized, or professional things as an institution builder, writer, consultant, whatever. And so I specialize not only in integration, but in essentially understanding existential and epistemic crises and revolutions and transitions. And you can see some of that in my series, therefore, on Kuhn. I'm showing kind of developing my work in that topic for the public, which I've normally only taught privately to my students or with my clients and speaking and consulting clients. So the reality of this subject is that the immediate background to anchor it, and I would say that, what do we do when we don't have any agreement about categories? Just find what's the nearest thing we can agree on as an orienting point. And the nearest thing everyone can agree on in the UAP phenomenon is that the phenomenon is historically and predominantly associated, though not exclusively, with the sky, because the things go in and out of the water too, and that it's luminous. And therefore, the nearest phenomenon we agree exists that's luminous in the sky are the celestial bodies surrounding the Earth. So the next step to take is, okay, so do we have anything in the history of human thought that says something about the visible celestial bodies that we know as the stars and the planets acting like UAP or UFO phenomena. And of course, if you study this, I'm not going to give a lot more away on this subject right now, but the answer is a quite definitive yes. Okay, so I'm not going to say a lot about that in this free kind of public lecture, but it's definitely a yes. And so I'm going to explain the yes briefly and provide a bit of evidence. And then I'm going to develop this to get to the issue of how are we to think about and respond to this phenomenon in relationship to the last question that I want to address. How can it help us understand where we are and where we may be going? So let me give you an example from one of the most mysterious and important intellectual movements in the history of science. Modern science, as we know it, is based in the Middle Ages. And in particular, historians of many different stripes agree that the 12th century in both the Jewish, Islamic, and Christian world at the time, if you want to think of it that way, underwent a major period of kind of renaissance. Incredible, exciting intellectual, spiritual discoveries were made. And in the European context, this was the foundation of the university system. So the university system is a major revolution in the human species because it creates a new social system around the division of advanced labor. I can't go into this now. I talk about this in my book. And if you read my work on technology and literacy and theory underground, my essay on Marshall McLuhan and other things, you can get some of my ideas about this. But basically, the division of labor is the central idea in sociology. And if you don't understand the division of labor, you don't understand the evolution of civilization whatsoever, nor can you understand its crises. And if you don't understand the advanced division of labor, you can't understand what academia is. And if you don't understand what academia is, you can't understand what modern science is. And if you don't understand what modern science is as part of the division of labor, you can't understand the social, political, existential, and historical and spiritual consequences and nature of the current crisis in science and academia. So that's something I know a bit about, as I said. I do a lot of work in that. And so when you understand that perspective, the 12th century is universally agreed on by historians to be very important. And one of the things that's very important is there's a movement broadly called 12th century Platonism. 12th century Platonism. This movement is very difficult. Its texts are not widely read by either academic theologians or by academic philosophers. And I would say this is for three reasons primarily. One, very few people even know about these texts, and it wasn't easy to access them unless you could access their Latin manuscripts. And that, of course, required an enormous learning. I'm no great Latinist, for example, and I certainly don't live at the Bodleian Library at Oxford yet, although I'd love to be able to just spend a lot of time researching there because they have things no one else has. But you basically have to have very advanced access to great libraries where you could read manuscripts in Latin. So the first thing is just most people didn't know about them or have access to them. The second thing is these are very difficult texts. In fact, they're so difficult, they're not really part of the conventional scholarly history of science, even though they really should be. And I incorporate some of it into my book that's coming out with Columbia. But I really intend to do a lot more work on it once that book is out. But something I'm very interested in. So this first thing is most people didn't know about them. They're very obscure, hard to access the text. Secondly, the texts themselves are very difficult. They're really difficult. One of the most important is a figure named Bernardus Silvestris, who wrote a text called the Cosmographia. The Cosmographia is a really important text, and it's very, very difficult. It's really difficult. You have to know a lot of stuff to even know how to orient yourself in those texts. And very few people today, even who are very learned, know even some of the basic things you have to know to engage those texts. And then they're kind of, the third issue is the texts are not only difficult, but they are, it's not obvious what they are. It's kind of like poetry and science together. And academia is very uncomfortable with that kind of, unity. And so, for example, the only literary genre remotely applicable to understand these texts would be the Lucretian poem De Rerum Natura. which is this very fundamentally important and gorgeously beautiful, powerful expression in beautiful original poetry of the atomistic worldview, and so derived from Leucippus and others. And this worldview is very important scientifically and spiritually for the history of Greek civilization and then Latin civilization because of Lucretius in particular, and then later what we call Western global scientific civilization as well. And so, ask yourself, if you're an academic, have you read, Lucretius De Rerum Natura, or have you ever even seen it offered in a modern academic philosophy department? And the answer is almost certainly no, it's not offered. I mean, you can get a PhD in philosophy at most elite schools and never even have to read Plato or Kant seriously. So, of course, you're not having to read Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. So these texts they were hard and obscure to access, hard to find, hard to know about. The texts themselves are actually very difficult just to read, to understand what they're doing. And that part of that difficulty is this other element, which is that they're a kind of genre, a mix of sort of scientific speculation and cosmology that is very foreign to the way modern academic systems have evolved. So it doesn't fit the division of academic labor well. In a sense, you have to be an expert in interpreting poetry who can also understand the philosophical, theological, scientific material that is the essence of these texts. So that's basically why we don't know a lot about the 12th century Renaissance and why there's very little work on it. Now, it's relevant, however, as you might have imagined, because a very important idea in the Cosmographia of Bernardus Silvestris is the idea of a planetary ruler. And Bernardus Silvestris is the only known origin, as far as I know, of this very strange term for this role or person or being or ruler called an oyarsa. C.S. Lewis, who ended his career as a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University. So C.S. Lewis was a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, a chair Cambridge created specifically for Lewis, because he was regarded as the sort of the leading expert on what we now call medieval and Renaissance literature, seen as a single tradition, which Lewis did very much to establish that that's the right historical way to see the Renaissance, as very much in continuity with what we call the Middle Ages or the medieval period, not a rupture. So after Oxford didn't give him a position that he deserved, Cambridge was happy to poach him, as academic institutions like to do. And Lewis is the person from whom, and the only person that I know of who wrote about this, from whom I learned about Silvestris's origination of the term oyarsa. The major edition of the Cosmographia, of course, discusses this term, and you can see the footnotes on that if you're a scholar. The term oyarsa is an extremely important term because the concept of it directly implicates the UAP UFO phenomena. The term denotes a supreme intelligence who manifests materially through the power, light, energy, and matter of a celestial body, specifically one of the planetary bodies understood in the Middle Ages. So one of the major 5 visible planets or stars that made up the 7-planet cosmology, the 7 heavens, which included the sun and the moon as 2, and then 5 others. So there was this concept that the planets are intelligently interacting with and governing their own domains and the area of energy created by their domain. Now, this concept is related to an idea I can't explore the significance of, but it's the 7 layers of heaven. And if you don't understand this idea, again, most of history and even the history of science is going to become misleading and difficult to understand, because the idea that there's 7 heavens and even 7 earths in many cases is a very old idea. And it's very influential in the foundations of modern Renaissance scientific thought in this proto-period of the Platonic Renaissance in the 12th century. Now, this idea of this planetary intelligence or influence, of course, therefore means that the power manifest in a planet, the oyarsa, has the authority to interact with and communicate with everything in its own domain, and is operating according to the musical order of the spheres. And the idea of music was a scientific field in the Platonic Academy. Music is one of the sciences. And Plato was very emphatic about geometrical understanding, and particularly the application of mathematics to an understanding of celestial phenomena. So in order to understand celestial phenomena, the Platonic schools thought you needed to rigorously apply math, of course, and in particular apply geometry. Now that's why we need experts in these fields. If you ignore that, you shouldn't even be taken seriously to me in any sense, no matter what your field is, because the best thinking about this subject has always insisted on using all of our best understanding of formal patterns, mathematical patterns, patterns in time, right? The cycles of the stars that we see, that we can track historically, right? And then any other patterns. Again, scientists, as scholars, we want to understand patterns. So when we see patterns and we see patterns recurring through time, we want to understand, what's going on there? Why is that pattern there? What does it mean? What might it tell us about what's going on in the world and what is going to happen in the world? If you see a meteor going towards the Earth, that pattern in the sky tells you that it's going to crash and cause a very big problem wherever it explodes. So we see patterns and we recognize that they have consequences when we understand the pattern. But if we don't understand the pattern, we see something and we don't know what it means for knowledge, but we know it has power, and there we're in this crisis where an unknown power creates unknown opportunities for knowledge, for change, and that therefore they could be threatening to us. And from that standpoint, therefore, an unknown power in the sky constitutes an unknown potential to alter human consciousness, by definition. Because it could be that once we have a scientific understanding of celestial phenomena, we will no longer be able to think the same way we thought before we understood what celestial phenomena really were. So it's quite clear then that lights in the skies that we don't understand constitute a basic, fundamental, existential, and epistemic crisis, in response to which a natural human psychological reaction is fear. And it's therefore also logical to think that all of those patterns of response to this based on fear would be self-reinforcing, and they would create self-replicating forms of social control based on fear around the phenomenon. Scientifically, you can't study a phenomenon well. I can't, as a scholar, as a kind of philosophical scientist, I can't study anything if I'm afraid of it. So even though the fear is psychologically understandable, it's a bad basis for doing science and scholarship. And so I think one should be curious and wondering what are these things? And the answer to that is quite simple. The first step we need to make, I think, towards a philosophical and potentially scientific revolution around the subject of UFO and UAP is very simple. It's to recognize that there's already a revolution happening in science. I'm trying to bring that revolution to more people through the Meanings of Life project I'm doing with Philip Ball. But it's a broad revolution. And I was recently talking to Philip Ball about this and making a case to him about this in relationship to our project. And his own work in biology, which is that there is a global revolution in science, and I would say it is the revolution of agency. Okay, and that is that you need the concept of agency to understand a wide range of scientific phenomena. And most importantly, the scientific phenomena for the project I'm leading with Philip Ball as the director in biology. Philip Ball wrote a book called How Life Works, an introduction to the new biology, in which he shows the concept of agency is essential in contemporary biology. So we know we need agency to explain things like ourselves. We increasingly are being told by other scientific fields that we need agency. In sociology, for example, a famous French sociologist has long been arguing, he recently passed away, for the idea of agency. I'm blanking on his name right now. I know it. I'll put it in the comments. And the idea of agency is quite simply what otherwise would be called personality, or meaning something that seems to cause change according to an independent mind or will or need. So the idea of agency is in fact conceptually inseparable from intelligence. And in the essay I'm writing for one of our projects on the meanings of life, I'm writing an essay on Philip Ball's book as a philosopher of science, not a specialist in biology, but a philosopher of science as a whole. And I argue in that essay that'll come out next year, and I'll release it for free. It's part of our project, which is funded for the public. I will argue that the concept of agency under any rigorous interpretation is inseparable from the concept of intelligence. And the minimum concept of intelligence involved in it, I therefore call it agentic intelligence. And the implication will be that intelligence itself, therefore, implies the concept of agency in almost all of the senses in which we use that term. Hence, the revolution in agency, as many of you know, is much broader than what I said. It's in biology, it's in science, but of course, very significantly, it's in AI, and therefore in all of our lives. And so therefore, we're living through the agental intellectual revolution, or the agent revolution. So the idea of the Oyarsa, this sacred, extremely powerful being, for example, that might govern Jupiter, the king, or might govern in some way Mercury, or might govern Venus. The idea is that astral phenomena exhibit agentic patterns. So this is what I argue in my book, Becoming Human: Philosophy, Science, and Religion from Plato to Posthumanism, which is coming out with Columbia University Press once I give my editor this final revision. And this revision, because I remember telling her, I need to make a revision based on the stuff I'm learning from the science work I'm doing with this project with Philip Ball, because I read Dr. Ball's latest work, who's a physicist, chemist by training, and polymath, editor at Nature, the most important prestigious scientific journal for over 20 years. And I realized when I read this book, I was like, this book is really incredibly important. I'm not a biologist. I'm talking as a philosopher and historian of science and religion. I was like, this book is a revolution just at the level of science because of the role of agency in the book. And I knew agency was a major theme in AI. As I said, that's an area I speak and consult in, and I'm very interested in it because it's connected to ideas of humanity and intelligence, obviously, and how they are changing us. And the agental revolution is what I'm bringing to the world in my book, is I'm integrating the agentic revolution and becoming human. And that's what the Becoming Human project is about. It's basically what underlies, I'm going to argue, the unity behind all of these different forms of separate revolutions of agency in science and culture. So that brings me to the last part of this talk, and that is to address the question of where this tells us that we may be at and where it might tell us we're going. And you could say, but did you answer the question about why is it so difficult to address this coherently? And I want to just transition to this final section by addressing a summary to that question, which is, yes, I did. I said that it's an existential and epistemic crisis. It's an epistemic crisis in the fundamental sense that we don't agree as a community of people who agree the phenomenon is obviously real, which now everyone agrees seriously in the sense that the government, scientific communities taking it seriously. Harvard astrophysicist, the chair of Harvard's astronomy department, you can't say this is not something scientists are taking seriously. $2 million for the Galileo project, which Avi directs. Again, this is a serious topic. The fact that there's a stigma is a question for history, not for science or philosophy in the same way. So far as we can't let that detain us from just, okay, let's figure out what's going on here. And we saw that the difficulty had to do with that epistemic crisis also being unified with and embodying an existential crisis, something that threatened the fundamental way that a human understands, experiences their existence. And when you have a crisis at that level, you feel profoundly threatened in principle by your ignorance. So the ignorance we have around a foreign power, even in geopolitics, is an ignorance that creates fear and caution. And that fear and caution can lead to a whole culture, or a kind of metastasization, if you will, of a culture of fear-based resistance. Fear-based inquiry is almost always going to naturally produce fantasies to affirm the fears of people. And fear is not a basis for science, which has to be directed by disciplined, rigorous curiosity and a genuine concern for truth, regardless of the cost to our personal views. So a scientist in principle sacrifices what they happen to think is the case for what they actually have evidence for based on rigorous pursuit of truth is the case. And if your evidence is for something you don't understand over what you know, and what you know is comfortable, and what you don't understand is very uncomfortable. The scientific virtue, the philosophical virtue, the virtue of the truth pursuer, is you sustain indefinite discomfort in pursuit of greater clarity, which will eventually resolve the discomfort and create a kind of ecstasy or joy of understanding and simply greater access to reality. So the existential epistemic crisis then is a single crisis. It's a crisis around the very existence of human knowledge and the very knowledge of human existence. The UFO UAP phenomena essentially has been something people would not agree on how to frame, because to frame it accurately at all itself constitutes a revolution. Why? Well, because this is an accurate framing of the phenomenon. The phenomenon is such that the significance of the phenomenon in its own right by any interpretation and any successful explanation of the phenomenon in its own right would constitute a complete revolution in the current values and knowledge that humans have. The values that humans have at this time indicate that humans believe they have the right to do whatever they want to non-human life forms that can't resist them, and to do whatever they want to the planet that gave birth to them as humans. That's the value system of what we could call global humanity. I'm not saying we all agree with it, of course, I don't. Many people don't, but we're all part of that system. We all exist in that system of global exploitation by the human species of all other life forms in the entire biosphere. And by even having, for example, nuclear weapons, we're assuming we have the right to potentially destroy all other life forms, which is ethically, I think, irrational to the extreme. It's an insane ethical presumption to think you have the right to develop the capacity to accidentally or inadvertently destroy yourself, never mind all the other species on the earth, or even damage the earth itself as a living being, insofar as you think of the earth as a biosphere and you respect the scientific plausibility of the Gaia hypothesis, then the earth certainly should be thought of, ethically speaking, out of a presumption of safety. Because should the earth turn out to be in any sense living in the way we would understand it ethically, then we ought to treat any such being as if it were living, in order that we don't violate its rights out of our ignorance, right? It's a very serious thing to not know something and then say, based on your ignorance, you're going to act as if you certainly know it is something. So if we don't know the earth isn't a living being, in the same way that trees are living beings, then we have no right to treat the earth as if we're not harming the earth as a also unitary global phenomenon that we should be deeply grateful towards and seek to, in some sense, respect or express our gratitude to, because we wouldn't exist without it. So that's what the value system of humans that I'm talking about at the moment is, that global value system that we as a species somehow are ethically entitled to endanger all life forms around us. And I guess just because we can. So that's the values, this presumption that humans have the ethical right, and that ethical right is linked to, in their own mind, the epistemic concept of humans, that we are the highest epistemological structure in the world and that we understand ourselves. Because if we didn't understand ourselves perfectly, how would we know that there aren't higher things, right? What if when you perfectly understood yourself as a dog, you would realize that your owner, a human, is a higher form of animal intelligence than you are? You know, maybe dogs don't realize that, but if a dog could fully know what a dog was, the dog's self-knowledge would involve a relative power in the hierarchy of other animals, particularly those upon whom it depends, like the way a dependent dog that we call a pet requires its owner for food, water, and shelter. And so the dog is definitely a living fellow being. But if you were to think in terms of a power hierarchy, the dog exists in a power hierarchy with the human that it may not in any way be capable of acknowledging. And the human doesn't require any significant acknowledgement of it, but basic compliance, if you will, with its desires to cohabitate with it and to love it however is, you know, appropriate to their level of philosophy of having a pet, in terms of whether you just take care of it and leave it outside or you treat it like a family member. People do all kinds of things, but they treat the being as a living other being. You can't just hurt animals. It's wrong. Everyone knows that. Well, you can't just hurt the earth. It's wrong. Like, everyone knows that, for the same way we know it about other things. And scientifically, we shouldn't act like we need to find that out. It's like, obviously the responsible premise is to assume, well, it looks alive. It gave birth to all of us. So even if we don't understand how it's a life form relative to all the life forms on it, that's a kind of difficult philosophical as well as scientific question. We should treat the earth like it's alive. And if you took that as a premise, then our value system is to deny the value of the earth's life. And basically the human value system as a global philosophy project is a negation of the value of the life on which it depends, which is irrational and disrespectful to reason and disrespectful to the cosmos. So this idea that we can threaten everything is just insane on rational grounds. And then the reason we think we can threaten anything is insane intellectually. And on scientific grounds, it assumes that we know ourselves perfectly, without which knowledge we couldn't know that there's not an obvious higher hierarchy than us. So for example, if you thought that the earth was potentially intelligent, the earth would certainly probably be a lot more intelligent than we are, because the earth would have knowledge of all of its senses, which would be the entire happenings on the surface and in the surface of the earth. And even just as an idea, that being is obviously a goddess relative to us as the beings through whom it's sort of out of whom we've come out of, that being the earth. So scientifically, the cosmos relative to us as an emanation of the cosmos is like a god, because we have to explain ourselves through the cosmos. And dependency of matter, and again, I'm kind of materialist in the sense, if your matter depends on something, then you obviously are related to it in some way that you need to acknowledge and properly understand if you want to understand how your power fits into the hierarchy of other material powers. So a human being on a planet is definitely not as powerful as the sun. So if the earth were to be thought of as a kind of organized system of energy matter that's being directed in some way agentically as a kind of, let's say, literary hypothesis to just think about how this would mean, entering the hyperspace that allows us to understand our human brothers and sisters throughout non-Western colonized cultures, as well as the past of our West own culture, in which we assumed other life forms, and including celestial life forms, were normal and that they were intelligent, then you would have a natural assumption that the sun would be a very high power and that the sun's actions would be significant for life on Earth. We know that's scientifically true. We have no idea whether the sun has a mind, even though that's something humans have basically always thought. So as a result of ignoring the role of planets and not understanding the cosmology I introduced in the last episode of the series on the philosophy of angels, the topic of UFO UAP has been, to me, unmoored from its natural historical scientific foundations, which is in the understanding of the planets, the visible stars of the solar system from the Earth, and their role in known scientifically significant, philosophically, existentially, theologically significant texts, of which the most important that I'm mentioning today are the example of the 12th century Cambridge Platonists, and the idea of the Oyarsa, or the planetary intelligence that governs, as a living, conscious, intelligent, super intelligent agent from our standpoint, the material influence and effects of its material sphere, its planetary sphere. And so insofar as we are influenced directly by those planetary spheres, the idea would be that they could directly interact with us as agents, including sending emissaries, which would have material and luminous characteristics designed to be both intelligible to us, but also insofar as we assume they were materially connected to these other planets or sun, also be materially very foreign to us. Insofar as we don't know a lot about those planets' matter, we would definitely not understand the material properties of any emanations of those material systems, were they to be agentic. So this is not to say what's happening. It's to say we need to anchor in what we do know. Stars are the obvious visible things in the sky that look like UFOs. UFOs, therefore, are often identified as things that look like stars moving and then, say, sometimes materializing into shapes. These shapes imply material conditions that are foreign to our current understanding. This is very strange. And that would be consistent with the idea of existing material agentic intelligence in the solar system itself. And therefore, I believe that where this topic is taking us, where the phenomenon is taking us, and the current level of disclosure is taking us, and where I hope it takes us, is what I'm trying to do in my work, the Becoming Human Project, in my book and in my teaching, is I think it's taking us into agentic planetary consciousness. Meaning, regardless of what people believe about ideas about whether actual material planets are actually intelligent, we will begin to understand the fact that we, for some reason, forgot that's what humans basically always thought is itself requiring psychological explanation. Humans have thought that the planets were agents for most of known history. So our not thinking of the planets as agents and not thinking of the stars as agents is extremely strange from a global psychological standpoint of the human species. And therefore, my argument is we need to understand the psychological, historical, spiritual, philosophical, scientific roots of why astral bodies, the celestial bodies, were experienced by humanity for its known history and still are experienced by humanity to this day outside of Western scientific cultures, why they were experienced as living, intelligent agents. And if we don't understand that, then how can we even understand human history, right? I'm not saying we need to believe that. I'm saying, what does it mean that we don't understand that? Why did we have to forget that? So as a scholar, as a philosopher and historian of science and spirituality, and who seeks to integrate the scientific standards that we have with recognizing that at a different level, science can't directly address as practitioners, policymakers, right? Leaders, we have to also make decisions with the knowledge that we have and the limited knowledge we have. And I think therefore we have to anchor in what do we know, celestial, is there any material in our traditions about celestial bodies being intelligent? Yes, there is. I gave some examples. Would that be consistent with the phenomenon that we see? Yes, it would be. What does that mean? It means we should at least psychologically and historically and philosophically understand why we have thought that the planets and the stars were intelligent and could behave in ways consistent with our own sense of agency and freedom, and therefore could move and project their visible luminous bodies in ways that would be consistent with so-called UAP or UFO phenomenon, or could underlie it. Then we will come to a greater understanding of why the human species is once again, having forgotten the importance of the planets and the stars as celestial agentic intelligences of the imagination, of the human imagination, we are being restored minimally to an imaginative appreciation of the fact that the lights in the sky have well been understood by the people who've seen them as living, communicating agents who are in some kind of dynamic relationship of intelligence with the solar system and our planet. And that's certainly a reasonable thing to take seriously as a historical idea. And we can use all of our resources as humans, scientifically and philosophically. I think we need a lot of philosophy of religion and science here, and philosophically to come to some clear understanding of this, and knowing it'll lead us, I think, away from fear and towards greater philosophical, spiritual, scientific understanding, which is certainly my goal, and I know the goal of many of you. I thank you for joining me. I'm Samuel Loncar, the philosopher and founder of the Becoming Human Project, and the founder of the Institute for the Meanings of Science, and the editor of the Marginalia Review of Books. If you appreciate this, please do subscribe and support the channel. Support me on Patreon, on Substack, or if you like just in general to want to support a charitable nonprofit that creates knowledge for the public good, you can give a tax-deductible donation to the Marginalia Review of Books. I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I wish you celestial and terrestrial blessings in the new year.